It's been a long day, and I have a feeling people may be tired. I am tired a bit. So I think what I'm going to do is to just tell you a story. Um, it's a story some of you may actually know. You can regard it as a bedtime story, although I cannot guarantee that it will be conducive to happy dreams. Um, I'm going to tell you this story. Indeed, it comes from our experience in the occupied territory, although I was not present at the event I'm going to describe. Um, it has a protagonist, or a hero. I think he would certainly qualify for Susan's category of heroes. He does in my books. His name is Rabbi Arik Ascherman. Um, I want to say that this is a very slight incident that I'm going to describe. The whole thing took less than a single minute. I hope to be able to show it to you in a video in just a couple of moments. It's a little hard to juxtapose this slight incident with the grand blood-stained canvas of the Oresteia. But on the other hand, there are certain rather evident affinities, as you'll see. I just might mention, by way of kind of foreshadowing what's coming, that one of the themes that comes up is one that has been there all afternoon, all the talks that I've heard, and that has to do with the notion of commensurability or incommensurability. I'll be coming back to that. Okay, so I have to introduce you to a place called Awartha. Awartha, it's a Palestinian village in the northern West Bank. It's a very, very old village. We're talking about probably thousands of years. It's a beautiful place. It's a holy place for all of the religions in Palestine. The grave of the scribe Ezra is supposed to be there. In the middle of the village, there are 70 tombs that are supposed to be the tombs of the elders of the Sanhedrin. And it's a pilgrimage site for people from all over, Jews, Palestinians, Samaritans, and Christians. But this village of Awartha has the great misfortune to be exactly adjacent to a settlement, one of the very veteran settlements. It's called Itamar. It's arguably the most violent site in the whole of the West Bank. It's inhabited by very fanatical, extreme right-wing Messianic settlers who take great delight in inflicting physical violence on their Palestinian neighbors in Awartha. I have to tell you one other thing by way of background, which you need to know, which is that, first of all, over the years, many years now, there's been this continuous phenomenon of settler violence, Israeli settler violence against the Palestinians of Awartha. Some of it really unthinkable. We're in Oresteia territory, really. There were two young Palestinian teenagers who were out in the field collecting scrap metal, and they were stopped by soldiers who appeared to have executed them in a kind of non-judicial execution. And not that long after that, there was a very violent retaliation by one of the Palestinians from Awartha who infiltrated the Itamar settlement and killed 5 members of a family there. So you can see it's a lot like the kind of materials that we've been discussing today and yesterday. So I'm going to describe an incident that happened in October of 2015. At the time of the olive harvest. The olive harvest is a particularly dangerous time for the Palestinians because the settlers of Itamar invariably come down to try to chase away the olive pickers and to do them physical harm if they possibly can. And so over the years, we've had volunteers, activists present during the olive picking in order to protect the Palestinian population there. In particular, there was an organization called the Rabbis for Human Rights, which was founded by Arik Ascherman, and they have a long history of protecting these people in Awartha. And on the day in question in October of 2015, Arik Ascherman was there with the olive pickers. There were soldiers there as well. The soldiers were very nervous. They expected trouble. And they actually closed down the olive harvest quite early on. And then what happened, the olive trees were sort of up at the top of the hill. What happened was that settlers from Itamar came down the hill into the olive groves and started stealing the bags of olives that the Palestinians had just picked. That's extremely common, actually routine for settlers near Palestinian olive pickers. So eventually the soldiers chased these settlers away, but then within a few minutes a fire broke out in the adjacent hill slope, almost certainly arson set by the settlers in the Palestinian fields. So Arik, he began to go up the hill to get a better look to see what was happening there with this fire. And meanwhile, a kind of heavy-set settler, masked, came down the hill with a knife in his hand. Arik was not alone. There was another activist with him and also a journalist. The second activist at some point turned back. And meanwhile, this armed settler, he first started throwing rocks at Arik, and of course he was screaming at him, and then he was waving the knife, and he got closer and closer. And then for a few moments he left Arik and tried to assault the journalist. And Arik, very characteristically for him, felt he was responsible for the safety of this journalist, so he ran over there and pushed him, literally pushed him out down the hill. You'll see it on the video. But by that time, the settler was on him, and he was, well, you'll see it's a very brutal moment, and he was waving the knife, and he came very, very, very close to killing Arik. He brought the knife down 3 times to his neck. Let me see if I can show you this. By good fortune, there was a Palestinian photographer there who captured the whole thing on film. That's the whole story. You can see it didn't take very long. It doesn't take very long to kill a person. And in itself, it's actually not all that unusual. I think it's fair to say that all of us, all the activists that I know, we've been through things like that, maybe not quite as bad as that, but we've all been attacked. And that's not really the part of the story that is of interest to me. I'll tell you what happened. Because Arik Ascherman is an Israeli Jew, the police were unable to ignore this event, which was, as you just saw, captured on film. Had he been a Palestinian attacked by a settler, then believe me, the police would have done absolutely nothing. It happens every day. The last couple of weeks, really last couple of months, it's been happening many times a day all over the territories. But in Arik's case, the police made a special effort to find the knife-wielding young man, and of course he turned out to be a young settler from Itamar. They found the knife in his room, and he confessed. So he was arrested. The case eventually came to trial after about a year. The settler boy was defended by somebody called Itamar Ben Gvir. That's a name some of you might know. He's now a member of the Knesset. To our eternal shame, he's, I mean, to call him a right-wing extremist would be to pay him a kind of compliment. He's kind of a violent, extremely violent fascist. He's also a lawyer, and he defended this boy. By the time the thing came before the judge, there was already a plea bargain in place. And that included the following components. They decided that although he was charged with aggravated assault, which is a really serious thing, and would normally land a person who's convicted of it in jail for some time, they decided that they would not actually give him a criminal conviction. He was given a punishment of 150 hours of public service, and a fine of 5,000 shekels, which is not very much. And he was also required to undergo some kind of psychotherapy to somehow rehabilitate him. The prosecution appealed and it went up to a higher court, and the higher court actually did hand down a criminal conviction, but everything else was exactly what I just told you. And as you might imagine, there was a kind of uproar on the left because everybody thought this was a ridiculously light sentence. By the way, the boy himself said in a TV video, he said, I should have killed him, but I didn't because I knew I'd get into more trouble. So I guess that means we still need some of those retired humanities around, I guess, something like that. By the way, Arik himself, when he was talking to me about this, he said he wondered if in the critical moment when the boy brought his knife 3 times to his throat, if that critical moment, perhaps, he said, maybe an angel of God intervened, like with Abraham, and stopped the knife, or in any case, something fortunately held him back. But now here's the interesting part, because what happened is that Arik, in court, pleaded with the judge not to send this boy to jail. And it's that I want to talk about this evening. In fact, when he told me the story, Arik, this was 5 years later, he said that when he heard that they wanted to send the boy to jail, Arik broke into tears. He couldn't stand the thought that this young man was going to be throwing away his life. And so he earnestly recommended to the judges that they not send him to jail, and there's no doubt that that had some effect upon the eventual sentencing. Arik explained his reasoning in a published statement. I'm going to read it to you. It's very short. He quotes Durkheim. He says, the sociologist Emil Durkheim posited 3 possible goals of punishment: revenge, protecting society, and rehabilitation. At the hearing, I made it clear I was not interested in revenge, and I didn't see any point to jail time. I asked the court to order steps promoting rehabilitation while protecting society, including Palestinians. Actually, Arik was worried that he was going to be drafted into the army, this young boy, and would have a gun in his hand and be sent into the territories. Arik goes on, I'm at peace with my decision to request rehabilitation. We must honor God's image in every human being. When a perpetrator works to rehabilitate himself or herself, we should all be giving the backing he or she needs, whether or not he or she is from our ideological camp. Okay? So I want to examine this response. And we'll take a little detour. I'll begin with something about forgiveness. Because in this case, forgiveness seems not to have been the issue at all. For the Jews, and Arik Ascherman is a believing Jew, for the Jews, forgiveness is associated with the notion of debt. If someone has hurt you, he or she owes you persistent proof that he or she feels true remorse. There is no compulsion to forgive in the absence of such proof. If the person does, however, show credible signs of remorse and is capable of putting them into word or deed, then in theory the injured party is supposed to forgive. That's what Maimonides says in his Mishneh Torah. However, the paradigm of debt does not, I think, exhaust the topic of forgiveness in Judaism. At stake is something that cannot be quantified or understood as a transaction. In my world, there are deeds that are actually unforgivable. If you take a casual look at the Israeli occupation of Palestine, you'll see lots of them. I'm not going to repeat the list of crimes that many of you have heard from me before. But I want to say that when one faces such a system, what space is left for forgiveness? And anyway, it's not for me to say. Perhaps our Palestinian friends will find it in their hearts someday to forgive us, Israeli Jews, assuming that acknowledgement of the crimes and some indication of remorse emerge. And even then, I am far from sure that I myself can forgive. There's a long list of Israeli army officers I've encountered in the field whom I would like to see standing in the prisoner's dock at the ICC in The Hague. Here I stand with Jean Amiri. So here's a preview of next year's conference. Amiri writes out of unimaginable personal pain of the Jews who, not long after the war, were, I quote, already trembling with the pathos of forgiveness and reconciliation, whether their name was Victor Golantz or Martin Buber, end of quote. And when I read that sentence, I was struck by a sense of relief, even though I too have a stake in forgiveness and reconciliation, assuming there is remorse. But maybe there is such a thing as facile forgiveness. So here's what Amiri writes. Let me put the shared screen up again. Here's the quotation. He says, whoever lazily and cheaply forgives subjugates himself to the social and biological time sense, which is also called the natural one. Natural consciousness of time actually is rooted in the physiological process of wound healing and became part of the social conception of reality. But precisely for this reason, it is not only extramoral, but also anti-moral in character. The moral power to resist contains the protest, the revolt against reality, which is rational only as long as it is moral. The moral person demands the annulment of time, in the particular case under question, by nailing the criminal to his deed. Thereby, and through a moral turning back of the clock, the latter can join his victim as a fellow human being, end of quote. And I just want to remind you, it's the topic for next year, but Janke Levitz, but Amiri had the quixotic hope that, or imagination or fantasy, that the sadistic torturer who had nearly killed him when he was a prisoner in Belgium during the war would, in the final split second before he was executed, turn into a fellow human being. That was Amiri's vision, and that's because, or partly because, Amiri says that the true nature of torture is to isolate the victim and reduce him to an absolutely total aloneness. Okay. But here's a thought. Maybe following Amiri, I have dismissed forgiveness a little too easily. There are people in this room, in this Zoom room, who will remember Amber Carpenter's very beautiful lecture. It was some years ago. I think it was during the conference on compassion, when she told this amazing Theravada Buddha story about a woman called Mallika. So Mallika, her husband and their 32 sons were executed by a cruel king just for the pleasure of inflicting the pain. But this Mallika advises her 32 daughters-in-law to cherish no resentment against the king, because the king, like all other beings, acted out of ignorance and from within the endless chain of conditioning that made him who he was. Amber says, she knows the infinite embeddedness, dependency, and consequently compromised nature of whatever and whomever we take to be a discrete entity. And from the depths of this understanding, she acts by stopping the violent chain of suffering at this point of most grievous pain. She has it in her to break the chain. So there's a Buddhist view. And here we have Maria Josa. Maybe some of you know the name. She was the daughter of Portia Shabangu, who was killed along with 2 comrades in an ambush planned by the notorious Eugene de Kock, the killer and torturer of hundreds as head of the South African counterinsurgency police during the apartheid period. Maria met her mother's assassin, who was still in prison, in 2012, and after evident soul-searching, she said to him, "I am healed and free from bitterness and hatred. I freely and fully forgive you, and I am ready to help others to heal." End of quote. And that was after de Kock had told her that after the ambush, he himself had found Maria's mother still alive, gasping for breath, and de Kock shot her twice more in the head. De Kock, by the way, did express remorse, possibly sincerely. I think Maria's astonishing ability to forgive extends the range of human capabilities. It's beyond the scope of my imagination. I want to juxtapose that story not with Ariks, which is of a very different order and took place in a different context, but with the words of Bishop Tutu, who said, I quote, "To forgive is not just to be altruistic. It is the best form of self-interest. It is also a process that does not exclude hatred and anger. These emotions are all part of being human. You should never hate yourself for hating others who do terrible things. The depth of your love is shown by the extent of your anger." End of quote. And Susan has already evoked the relatives of the 9 victims of the Charleston massacre in the Episcopal Church in 2015 who expressed their open-hearted forgiveness of the gunman, the white supremacist Dylan Roof. Okay, so much for forgiveness, but again I want to say Arik is a Jew. He's immersed in living out the ethical commandments of the tradition. And I have to say again, forgiveness was not the issue. The boy never really asked for it. The debt was never repaid. There were almost no signs of anything like remorse. If you knew Arik, you might understand how that almost slipped into my sentence. But not everyone can be Arik Ascherman. Most of us, I think, including myself, would have some wish to see the almost killer punished. How would you feel if it was your throat that had been touched by the knife? And let us not forget that the knife was wielded by a person whose mind was full of hatred and who was acting in the service of an ideology that justified stealing all Palestinian land and expelling all Palestinians from the land of Israel, and only of Israel. And yet, Arik had no interest in revenge. What he wanted most was rehabilitation and restorative justice. I want to say a few words now about revenge in relation to remorse. Revenge is probably a transient pleasure. Dissatisfaction is built into it. Although there are philosophers and jurists who defend it as a necessary principle in the making of justice, the philosopher Arindam Chakrabarty has, I think, demolished their arguments. I'll be happy to point you to his paper if you'd like. Anyway, there's a paradox built into the thirst for revenge. The victim wants not only to hurt the perpetrator, but also to impact the latter's self-awareness, to make him wish to God he'd never delivered the initial hurt. But it's hard to achieve that if the perpetrator is killed in the course of the victim's revenge. In this respect, there is a parallel with the mechanics of remorse, which, as Georg Simmel says, does not tell us what to do, but rather what should have been done. And if one follows that line of thought, then one can only agree with Vladimir Janke Levitz that moral conscience always arrives late. We want him or her who hurt us to suffer in an agony of remorse, the remorse that should have been there in potential before the crime and was not. And what if it never arrives at all? I want to stay a moment longer with Janke Levitz. He's the greatest modern theorist of remorse. And he has this insistence that remorse, to be real, to be effective, has to happen spontaneously, not as the result of an external stimulus, not because of the inculcation of a pattern program of religious or ethical feeling, or any other, what he calls extrinsic element. Here's what he says. This beneficial sadness of remorse emanates from the very center of our misdeed. This is not a treatment that would be administered from the outside in order to counterattack the sickness. On the contrary, the remedy here naturally and organically prolongs the misdeed like an intravital medication. Evil is in itself its own medication. Thus, remorse germinates spontaneously from the depths of our sins, and reciprocally, our sin exudes remorse by virtue of a curative power that is proper to it. There are no more long quotations to come. Anyway, I just want you to see that for Janke Levitz, remorse is a sign that the process of healing has already begun, actually might even be close to its conclusion. And he thinks that the bad conscience of evil is a great good. And if you do get this spontaneous experience of remorse, which has nothing to do, Janke Levitz says, with consciously trying to redeem the misdeed, and is not because of the shame that one feels, but it's something else. Given these conditions and this organic, involuntary arising of remorse from within, the result for the remorseful person is what Janke Levitz calls moral joy. Moral joy. Those of you who would read his book, The Bad Conscience, you should read the paean to moral joy in the final chapter. It's an amazing, amazing text. But for Ariks' attacker, utilitarian considerations are uppermost. He's sorry about the near murder only because it got him into trouble. So if remorse for an evil committed is a human achievement, then we might pity the person who cannot come near it. Now there's the pragmatic argument, even for cases of absent or aborted remorse. This comes close in a way to what Susan mentioned about the Forum of the Bereaved Families. It is surely better to look ahead, to move toward a better future, than to remain stuck in the unredeemed pain of the past. So was this notion the rationale of Ariks' compassionate act? I don't think so. I mean, it might be a part of it, but there's something more. Of a spiritual nature, although spiritual is not a word that I normally use. Some well-intentioned people would no doubt argue that holding on to a hurt is unhealthy and that it would be much better to let go of it. No one has ever described just how to do that. It is not a matter of simply willing this internal movement. In fact, holding on is a poor description. Something is torn inside and cannot be sewn together. It's like a Telugu proverb about a man who falls into a river where a bear happens to be waiting, and the bear takes hold of the man in a bear's embrace. An observer standing on the shore, seeing the two, man and bear, floating down the river, he cries out to the man, "Let go of the bear." And the man cries out, "I let go of him long ago, but he won't let go of me." I think it's kind of analogous to that business of not holding on to the pain. In any case, Arik responded and acted out of non-utilitarian reasons and not out of self-interest. Remember Bishop Tutu's words. Maybe he had a notion, Arik, of potential proleptic remorse. Is there such a thing? Yes, there is. In fact, prospective potential remorse might be almost as important to being human as actual retrospective remorse. Let's see where that thought takes us. Arik's words, "We must honor God's image in every human being." Out of the 613 mitzvot, the commandments that Jews are meant to perform, this one stands out. I think it's probably the only mitzvah left that I could affirm. And its existential priority in the awareness of a person like Arik speaks to the old tradition of Jewish humanism that I knew from my grandfather and my parents. There is something in all of this that suggests a principle of incommensurability. There is nothing, no punishment, that could be commensurate with killing another being. Death resists our meager habitual attempts to calculate, to create some kind of balance sheet where, let us say, some good might possibly offset something not so good. I know I think like that all the time about minor and major things in my life, and I don't think I'm alone. But calculations of that sort always siphon off our deeper aliveness. It's like asking if my beloved loves me as much as I love her. What kind of a question is that? First of all, it's a very familiar question. But still, even to formulate it in those words is to vitiate the fact of loving. The really important things in life, including the moral life, cannot be commensurate with anything other than themselves. So here's what I think about Arik and the boy with the knife. This will just take another maybe 4 minutes. One might say that Arik entered into a necessary wager, rather like Pascal's. It is wise to believe in God, Pascal said, or to live as if God exists, because if you are wrong, there's nothing to lose, and if you are right, then the rewards are immense. This principle is sometimes said to be an early articulation of probability theory. Arik, for his part, was prepared to wager that the young settler with the knife might yet actualize God's image in himself. Unlike most bets, this wager is not a probabilistic one. You can't average out the statistics and come to a decision. Either one takes on the bet or one doesn't. And while God was not a party to Pascal's bet with himself, the Jewish God is not immune to wagering with himself, as he did, for example, when he ordered Abraham to sacrifice his son, hoping, I would want to think, that Abraham would refuse to carry out this command. To wager on the potentiality of a person who was separated only by an infinitesimal margin from killing an innocent good man requires a certain compelling spaciousness in heart and mind. It is a bold move of uncertain outcome. It speaks to what could be called tough compassion. Tough compassion, a non-absolute, unsentimental, unromantic form of being and feeling. It has within it no calculus of remorse and forgiveness, only an idea, precarious in itself, that every human being, even my potential killer, embodies God's image. Probably what is required is a sensual awareness of that image in one's own body, a mode of knowing that is deeper than words and that comes without complacency or pride. Arik was unable to close off the possibility that his near assassin would become a person and would grow. An intuitive clarity of the heart sees the quixotic prolepsis built into the bet. Therefore, the bet is worth taking on, in order to affirm your own humanity along with that of the violent other. I think that's what being a Jew once meant. I've seen the bet pay off. Authentic remorse may need to germinate for years, even decades, before it breaks through the brittle surface of the mind. I've met soldiers who were overwhelmed by remorse after they emerged from the moral numbness that is the soldier's default. I have watched settlers who, for at least a moment, were able to go beyond the toxic indoctrination they undergo in the settlements. I know someone, a young student of ours, who grew up in Itamar, where Arik's wild enemy came from, but who miraculously arrived by herself at the certainty that she could never treat another human being the way she'd been taught to relate to Palestinians. Never. I think it is not inconceivable that a day will come when millions of Israelis will inch slowly against all odds towards some such recognition. I wouldn't bet on it myself, but neither would I rule it out. Arik Ascherman must have acted out of that rare, expansive space in the self. No doubt faith was involved as well. The faith that recognizes the possibility that the attacker might never know remorse, might never heal, but that nevertheless refuses to give up. Even a tiny taste of remorse to be distinguished from mere regret, counts for something in the world. That kind of faith is based on a benign uncertainty. That's the beauty of it, and the reason it suits the dark and noxious world of the Israeli occupation. In a particular moment, a good man knowingly refrains from adding an extra dose of pain, that of a sterile vengeance, or even of justice, vis-a-vis the person who nearly killed him. And all this because he knows from his own experience that a human being in potentia sometimes becomes one for real. Thank you.
David. Sometimes you leave me speechless, and that's what you've done at the moment. Does anybody else? Eva, do you want to say something? It looked like you wanted to.
There was just a tiny little remark that came to my mind when I was listening to you, David, and this is a linguistic one. 3 years ago, I had to give a talk on Vergebung und Verzeihung. In German, you have two different words that have a tiny little difference in them.
Yeah.
Means vergeben is exactly the translation of forgiving in English.
Yeah.
So the other one asks you to forgive him, and you give this forgiveness.
Right.
While the much more interesting concept is verzeihen, because it comes without any kind of asking of attempt of the other, the sinner, basically.
Right.
Means you inside is ziehen, so you drag yourself out of the whole thing and you just give it away and say, yeah, this is not my conflict anymore. I don't want him to be I don't want his remorse. I just drag myself out of it and come to live in peace with me in my world. And this in a way came to my mind when I was listening to your example of Arik. This is just what just came to my mind, and because Susan addressed me so quickly that I had no other idea to come up with.
You looked like you wanted to say something.
No, sorry, I didn't. I was just thinking.
It's very nice.
But
let me just say that I admire people who are capable of verzeihen. I think it's a good thing, but
no, it's just interesting that I'm not sure if the concept linguistically does exist in English or in other languages. I was actually astonished myself when I was reading a book about this entire concept, and that almost linguistically there is a difference.
Yeah.
David, why? Sorry, did you want to reply?
Well, there are two words in Hebrew for forgiveness. There's slicha, which is a normal, relatively mild one, and there's something called mechila, which is a much deeper kind of act. That's the kind of forgiveness that Maimonides is concerned with, and as I said earlier, it seems to be somehow connected to a notion of debt, but also to something more than that. It's probably connected to that idea that Arik, I've heard him say it maybe many dozens of times, that all human beings are created in the image of God. It's not just a façon de parler. He really, really thinks that, or knows it, I should say. Yeah.
That's interesting, as I met quite a number of African Americans when I was in Mississippi who they would say everyone is a child of God, even the Ku Klux Klan member. And they would also cite King, but King used the sort of argument that you quoted with Tutu, or maybe Tutu was quoting King, hard to say, about the way in which hate damages one's own soul. But there was this very strong, I heard it repeated by a lot of people, sometimes by white people as well, who are anti-racist activists. Everyone is a child of God. And I'm also not sure how to get there. You said you can't do it. Do you know what holds you up in yourself? Oh, and by the way, I just wanted to add one more thing, because you mentioned there was this very famous video of the families of the people who were massacred in Charleston,
Right.
Offering their forgiveness really out of this religious tradition, despite the fact that the guy has not asked for forgiveness and has more or less said he would do it again. But those families were not the only ones. Later, it turned out there were quite a few who said, this is not.
You know, all I can say, I kind of admire people who can feel that genuinely. I guess Mahatma Gandhi was apparently like that. You know, that one of the amazing things about Gandhi, who is not a hero of mine, by the way, but one of the amazing things is that he claimed that one should act moral action, that is nonviolent resistance, but without judging the person against whom you are acting, the person you are resisting, your potential killer or oppressor. That's an incredible thing. There's a very amazing essay about it by a friend of mine. I can send it to you. I'm not on the whole sympathetic to that, but I find it a very remarkable human achievement.
I'm not sympathetic to it at all. I think this is another cultural phenomenon that I think is mistaken. The idea that, the height of virtue is don't be judgmental. Sorry, I'm a Kantian. You don't think without making judgments.
How can one not judge the person who is doing these terrible things? I don't know how you can do it. But you should read Akil essay.
Even before that, you cannot think without making judgments. Forget even about moral judgments. You can't. So
it's the idea that you don't judge the person, you just judge the action. What he's doing is wrong, but it's not that he is wrong. The thing is definitely wrong. To judge him is something else again.
Yeah, there's something of that. That's true. Although I think in Gandhi's case, because he was really crazy, in Gandhi's case, it went a little further. And I think he really felt that one should somehow be able to remove oneself from judging altogether, but still do the right thing. It sounds paradoxical, which is probably what it was,
Elida.
Yeah, thank you, David, for this wonderful last presentation, and your meditation on remorse and this impressive case that you brought before us. I think the terms that Eva just mentioned in German, they're quite paradoxical, because if you put them into nouns, you get the opposite effect, because Vergebung is a very loaded word, whereas Verzeihung is exactly Slicha. So the one is just a form of performance. And I also, what came to mind was Eva Moses Kor, who was one of the Mengele twins from Auschwitz. And in the 90s, she started to come to Germany. She filled whole big rooms and halls with people whom she forgave. And the people in the room, of course, were not guilty in any palpable sense. It was a later generation who felt an urgent need to be forgiven. And this is what she supplied. But her motive was very different. Her motive was very close to tutu, as a form of forgiving in a sense of self-interest. She wanted to detoxify herself so that she would not pass on any of that to her children.
It's hard to hear you. Maybe if you turn the picture off, or other people hear better than I am.
Okay, and I also wanted to thank you for one of these 613 mitzvot, which you pointed out, because I attended wonderful small workshop or conference on the Bible and human rights. And I really searched it. And I found many more than my Israeli colleagues were able to come up with.
Right.
They're usually not ritually repeated or not part of the most focused on passages.
Yeah.
But this one, I just thank you, because I will now add it to my list, and this is a precious list which I will share with you.
Thanks a lot, Paleda. Thank you.
Stephen, you had your hand up. Up there. It's like he's.
I'm here.
Good.
Sorry.
Good.
Hi. Excuse me. I'm just wondering, David, it seems like there's so many ambivalent forms of forgiveness. I think what Ava was talking about is a kind of stoic disengagement where you want to have nothing to do with the person. And you're not asking for remorse. You just are trying to separate yourself, not be polluted. There's another kind, which is a kind of empowerment. I am going to be the actor. I will forgive you. I have this power. I may even have the power to convert you. It's almost a theomorphic thing.
Yeah.
So I feel like that's ambivalent, and that forgiveness is ambivalent enough. And it makes me wonder, would you really think that there is no moral benefit for that kid to have been punished by the law? Couldn't that have also helped him? Since forgiveness is ambivalent morally, and criminal punishment can have beneficial consequences, the way you described it was almost too black and white for like a fanatic.
Thank you. Let me address the last little bit. That's the question, actually. I was trying to make sense to myself of what Arik did. I don't know. In fact, had I been in that position, as I said, I think I would have wanted him to go to jail. Maybe also, as you're saying, for his own good. I don't know if I would have been capable of thinking that, maybe. But in Arik's case, I think he was rightly afraid, knowing the Israeli jail system, that the guy would just enter into this endless cycle of crime and greater crime, more and more violence and drugs and the whole crazy thing. So he didn't want that to happen. Maybe he was wrong. I mean, I don't know.
Okay.
Don't
That's
know.
true.
Let me go back for a second to the Stoic position, because I'm partially open to this myself. Marcus Aurelius says, and I like Marcus Aurelius a lot. I take the meditations with me usually when I go into the field. In case I get arrested, there'll be something I would like to read. So he says, I think it's in the 4th book, he says, someone has hurt you. You think someone has hurt you. He has hurt himself. That's what Marcus Aurelius says. Yeah. So, I mean, I like that a lot, except I don't believe it. Because there's so much evidence of all kinds of horrible people all over the place who have inflicted enormous suffering and who are just doing fine, as the psalmist says, they're flourishing like the palm tree, and so actually I don't really believe it, but I kind of like to believe it. Maybe there is some level of reality somehow where that might be true, in the sense that the person, let's say a person like Netanyahu, that he's deeply impoverished in himself. That's also, I think, in a way close to what Arendt would have said. So impoverished that in a way his evil is his own self-punishment. Yeah. I think that's a way of thinking about such things. It's true.
So actually, Arendt also said in one of her shorter texts, that actually often the people who had committed the greatest crimes had no, bad conscience at all, whereas people who had, perhaps it was all sins of omission, they hadn't done enough. Those were the people whose consciences were really hurting. So I don't know what
kind of empirical fact, I'm afraid. I don't know. The Indians.
That was actually. Sorry, that was actually in Kostek's contribution exactly this time, because the people with the moral conceptions, even if they're most evil, think that they have good reason to do what they are up to.
Yeah.
I just wanted to remark two more remarks to Stephen. Apparently, I didn't get it totally right. The concept of verzeihen is not only that you kind of detach yourself totally from this other person, but in the Christian sense, it is the freedom. It is the utmost freedom that you can find if you this kind of forgiveness that you give even without being asked for it. This is the concept is to regain sovereignty. In such a bloody conflict. We're not talking about minor misdemeanors, but real stuff like the child or whatever. And the other thing is just what David said about Ariks' idea that the boy was not to be put into prison, but in our entire moral concept that we have discussed the whole day, this is just so the moral system is wrong in Israel. This is why he should not go into prison in the world that we would hope for. I think also Arik would be, as I am, on Stephen's side, that the young boy needs to be punished to learn something about for the long rest of his life. So,
I should tell you one more thing about the facts of this story. The boy did go to therapy, and eventually there was a meeting between Arik and him, a restorative justice meeting. Initially, the boy said initially he said he was open to that. Then he got cold feet and refused. But at some point, after I don't know how long, many months I think of therapy, he did agree to meet, and they had a 2-hour meeting. I don't know what happened at that meeting, because they're always those are private meetings and they're not meant to be divulged publicly, and Arik wasn't prepared to say anything to me about it. But he did say, in a more general sense, just talking about the whole situation, that it was very clear to him, to Arik, that the boy was really working on himself, and he knew that he had to leave this toxic environment in Itamar, and indeed the family left, his parents also. He was lucky enough to have good parents, even though they were living in Itamar, and so they left and they moved to Tel Aviv or something like that. I don't know where the boy is now. I think Arik somehow knows, but it's not public knowledge.
I want to just say, this is the last chance both to the audience and to the participants to raise a question, make a point, not only to David's talk, but to anything else you'd like to say about this conference. We'll give everybody a minute or so. I have one thing, David. I was actually thinking. I mean, I do really have a problem with forgiveness without remorse. I think genuine remorse is very easy to forgive. But I was also thinking a little bit about what my fantasy would be for Orestes, which did not happen. She's saying there are several comments. I could just imagine a situation in which, Orestes said, yeah, well, she killed my father, and so I had to do it, but I sort of see he killed my sister, and, you would like some acknowledgement, or I would like some acknowledgement from Orestes, that something about was just. I am, Misha, I just got a note from Misha saying there are comments. I can't see them in my Q&A. Misha, if you can see them, can you read them? Or are you not?
Yes. So there are several more comments from Mario Kessler, who says, many thanks for mentioning the Rabbis for Human Rights Initiative and Arik Ascherman. Among the most militant settlers attacking Arabs and their Jewish friends constantly at the olive harvest is a certain David Axelrod, the leader of a militant group from Kfar Tapuach near Ariel in the West Bank. To my deepest regret, this Axelrod is a grandson of Leon Trotsky. Have you come across this name?
I know the name. I've never met him.
And to end with a more optimistic tone, Axelrod's mother has in her small Jerusalem apartment a picture of Martin Luther King Jr. Yeah, I think that's it.
Yeah.
So, Wendy, was that a hand?
It was a hand. I've been silent most of the time, but I've been quite moved. More moved than I usually am by an academic conference. I think it was an extraordinary group of people you brought together. It's the usual suspects, but they brought an unusual wide perspective. I wasn't a dud paper among them, and I wondered if you have any hope of publishing them and putting them together. When they're put together, it's an extraordinary, crazy quilt of human emotion as well as knowledge and skill in deploying that knowledge. It's unlike any conference I was ever at. I just wondered what your plans were for it.
I haven't made any yet. First of all, I honestly wasn't sure it was going to work.
It was a crazy idea.
Look, for a number of years, we've had, and you've been at some absolutely extraordinary conferences, you know, of the board, and it is just a wonderful group of people.
The Job conference was particularly wonderful.
Individually as a, which conference?
The book of Job.
Yeah, that was great. But we've had a number. You haven't been at all of them. And for a while, I got very, very nervous around the middle of June and thought, boy, last year was great. Are we going to be able to do this again? And if we don't, am I going to be disappointing all these wonderful people? And actually, I stopped worrying about that a few years ago, because this has now been not everybody has been here for 20 years, but it's been a long time, and it's worked. I wasn't sure how well it would work on Zoom. And so I'm absolutely grateful to everybody who's participated in one way or another. Whether or not we publish it, I mean, as you said, it's not just the thoughts, it's also the emotions. And the truth is, even though some of us are, very good writers, it's not clear to me that that comes across on paper. This conference has been recorded. You can tell anybody you like. It will be in our archives forever and ever. Pardon?
Maybe that's good enough then.
Yeah. I really regret we didn't always film everything, and there were some things that I really wish we'd film. Now we film everything, and that's at least something that people can come back to should they choose. So it just remains to me to thank once again all of the extraordinary people on my board for taking part in this. Thank you to those of you who have been watching and sometimes asking questions. Inshallah, the Einstein Forum will open again in real time on October 4th. We're now closed for the season after this. And you'll...
Real space. You mean in real space?
In real space, yeah, in real life, IRL, in real life, yes. We have every intention of opening in our normal rooms. And we will meet again around this time of year. I will publish the date very soon. As David mentioned, our conference next year around this time, end of June, beginning of July, will focus on Jean Amiri. And it will be, we hope, a normal conference without Zoom and conversations in the coffee breaks and wine in the evening, and a chance for our normal atmosphere, but I actually think we did manage amazingly to reproduce it on Zoom. So thank you all for that.
Bravo. Bravo.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Suzanne. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all.
And everybody at the Einstein Forum, the whole crew.
Yeah. Sorry, you're reminding me. So because this was online, the rest of our staff had less work to do with logistics. Usually it's quite a lot of work. But there was definitely work involved in the logistics. I would like to thank everybody, but in particular, our business manager and technology manager, Gur Sanko, for keeping us organized and keeping us going. Thanks to you all.